Good evening and welcome to our webinar this evening on FBO fees and airport access. I'm Tom Haines, Senior Vice President of Media, Communications, and Outreach here at AOPA. And this evening we'll be talking about just a big important issue for general aviation and what the fees are at some FBOs, why they are that way, and what the FAA is doing about it. And to kick off the evening, we've got a great bunch of panelists here. AOPA President and CEO Mark Baker, our General Counsel at AOPA, Ken Mead, Justin Barkowski, who is Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs, and Jeff Hamiel, who is an airport consultant and former CEO of the Minneapolis-St. Paul Metropolitan Airports Commission. And thanks for coming out to Maryland, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You could have left the cold weather behind. We would have been okay with that, but it's brutal out there this evening. So we got lots to talk about. It's a big important issue for general aviation, what's been happening, and AOPA has been working a lot on it. The FAA has responded as well. So Mark, let's get started. How is it that this issue really came to the surface here at AOPA regarding what's the fees that pilots are being charged at airports?
Well, Tom, as you know, and both of us do a lot of traveling to meet airports and pilots around the country and see about the activity and talk to transient pilots. And there's been a lot of concern about this egregious pricing, particularly as consolidation started to take place in the FBO world over the last number of years. And one of the things that concerns us always at AOPA for the nearly 80-year history is about the cost of flying and the access and the freedom to fly. And this intersection of challenges to egregious pricing, over 1,000 members have complained about specific airports. And again, generally, we're talking about 40 or so airports, right. Not the large majority. The large majority of FBOs treat us fairly, do great work. We're very happy with what they do. But we're concerned about this insidious nature of what seems to be a monopolistic behavior and pricing at what the market can bear versus what's fair. And so we've taken the opportunity to study this over the last year, and I've assembled a lot of experts, many of them in the room here right now, to really take the time to find out what's really going on in the marketplace. And I think all of us agree in aviation, anything that impedes access or people making decisions not to go because it's not affordable any longer to travel there needs to be looked at and considered. So as we started to look at this and again understand which airports are the real problems, you know, we asked for an opinion from the FAA, and I met with Michael Huerta here just recently, just before he retired from the FAA job, and I think he did a great job for us in general aviation, as he looked at and reflected about a position that the FAA has on FBOs and airport sponsors. And frankly, the rules didn't change, but they probably haven't been highlighted as clearly, and making sure the airport sponsors know that they're responsible for this. So I'd like to show the clip with sure. Michael and share his thoughts and the thoughts that he's now broadly printed for dissemination. Just recently, the agency issued basically a directional guidebook, if you will, about the right way the airport sponsors should be managing their job, which I think is the correct way to look at it. And I think it's going to be important for us to have that kind of partnership with the airport sponsors and sure. and the industry. But it was nice to see that kind of view about public access and transparency coming out of the agency in a meaningful way.
Well, what we wanted to do here was clarify for everyone what the roles and responsibilities of operating a public use airport actually are. Many airport sponsors think of themselves more as landlords as opposed to an actual operator of a public use facility. And what we wanted to make sure through the FBO policy was to make sure that everyone understands that if you are granted a certificate to operate a public use airport, yes, it's a privilege, but it brings with it certain responsibilities. And that means that it needs to be made available on reasonable terms to the public. That's why it is a public use airport. That's why the federal government is willing to underwrite some of the costs associated with that. The question becomes, okay, well, whose job is it to ensure that? And I think we had, in some circumstances, evolved to a situation where an airport sponsor effectively delegated that to their lessee, whether that's an FBO, whether that is some other operator of a different facility. And we wanted to make sure that everyone understands that the sponsor always has the responsibility to ensure that, this is being made available on reasonable terms to the public. And it's not a change of policy, it is a statement of what the policies actually are. And by shining the light on this, I think that will go a long way toward clarifying everyone's responsibilities, and I think the market will respond accordingly.
So he's pretty clear there that that it is the airport sponsor, or the airport operator, airport owner, however you want to phrase it. It's their responsibility to oversee the businesses on the airport. He made that pretty clear.
I think he did a nice job of articulating what's always been basically the policy,
Right.
and making sure that now we can find a path for approaching the airport sponsor who generally wants to do the right thing. And again, most of the FBOs want to do the right thing. But when there is a need for a circuit breaker, how do we pursue that process? And,
Right.
And I think the free market it ultimately does rule.
Right, and there are a lot of tools that we could use to help improve kind of the free market experience at airports. But before we talk, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but Ken, how big is the issue? How many complaints have we received, and what have we been doing about that?
Well, we've received over 1,000 complaints, and they closely corresponded to this wave of consolidation in the industry. Some people may recall that probably about 3 or 4 years ago, Landmark acquired Ross. And about a year after that, Signature Aviation acquired Landmark. In both instances, the Justice Department reviewed those acquisitions, and in both instances, the Justice Department ordered some divestitures of some locations that would otherwise be acquired. But what we've found is that the complaints seem to center on airports that have the following characteristics. One, it's a monopoly position FBO, usually part of a large chain, but not always. There are some notable exceptions. Very long-term lease, 20, 30, sometimes more, and 100% of the access, ramp access, is controlled by the FBO under a leasing arrangement, so that there is no alternative but to park at that FBO. And the FBO can in turn impose fees. And sometimes those fees are very high. And the FBO may say, you know, if you don't want to pay this high fee, then you can buy our fuel at a very high price too. Those are called tying arrangements. Transparency in pricing, where you don't really know what the fee is going to be. It's not available electronically. There's nothing like a Travelocity or Orbit system where you can just say, what is the fee at this place? You can't do that. And limited.
Don't you find that odd here in the 21st century?
Well,
that we can't find this information out except maybe by calling, and even then it's not always
It's
out.
unbelievable. We have an effort underway where we're trying to get this fee and pricing information. And at a number of places we're told, well, we don't want to provide it to you, or we don't have it available electronically. You just have to get this information by calling. In 2018, you can't get this information available electronically and digitally. It's just incredulous.
Right, right. So we are beginning to gather some of that information, and we'll see what we're able,
Yes,
we're able
we
to do
will.
with it. So the Part 13 complaints, we filed 3 of those as a result of, we looked at all these complaints and found some of the patterns. Give us a little texture about some of the complaints. What were some of the ones, like the types of fees that people were expected to pay, for example?
Okay, well, there were 3 airports, Waukegan, Key West, and Asheville. Today we withdrew the Waukegan complaint because they've taken very substantial corrective action.
Right.
We're very pleased to see that, and they should be proud of that.
Right.
But all 3 airports had the characteristics I was describing before. Monopoly position,
Yep.
no competition, 100% control of access to the public ramps area, high fees just to park your plane at a public use airport that's been bought and paid for with federal funds and the local community's money,
Right.
limited airport oversight, and difficulty in ascertaining what the prices were.
Right. And one of the concerns that we've had is while we see these mostly concentrated at 30 or 40 airports around the country. We have also see it become a little bit insidious in that some other airports that don't quite fit those characteristics have begun to almost feel licensed to charge those kind of fees as well, haven't we?
Yes, we have. Mark used the word insidious. That's what we're most concerned about with this wave of consolidation, that you have a situation when you have monopolies growing and there's limited oversight.
Right.
And the fees are going up and our complaint meter is ringing. That can spread. So we want to stop that from spreading. You know, one of our major compass points here at AOPA and in the general aviation community has to be the affordability of flying. A lot of times you think of affordability of flying, well, it's flight training. It's the cost of the aircraft. It's the cost of the maintenance of the aircraft. But once you take care of all those things, clear the decks of those costs, then you say, well, how about I want to use my plane now. I want to fly to these airports that we've set up this Aviation Airport Trust Fund for. And that's what this is all about. It's about the affordability of flying. And when you have a monopoly position, let's face it, that is not free enterprise. Mm-hmm. That's not competition.
Right. So we began looking at this, as you said, Mark, and we took this to the FAA more than a year ago. I think it was December of 2016. You guys had a meeting with the FAA. And then we continued to kind of analyze the complaints and ultimately filed the 3 Part 13 complaints that we just talked about. So a lot has happened. The FAA recently, now in this past December, just came out with some guidance. So Justin, talk a little bit about that. You were heavily involved in that, and what is it that the FAA guidance says?
Yeah, so one thing that they've laid out is expectations for pilots, you know, what they should be expected to do in these types of situations. They've also talked about expectations for airports. You know, what are their roles and responsibilities, as the administrator mentioned in that clip, and also actions that the airport can take. And what can they do? What authority do they have? What is their role in all of this issue? So really, the first thing, you know, expectations of pilots. We get this a lot. We get a lot of complaints coming in, and we've talked to a lot of them, and we appreciate all of that input. And really, the expectation is, you know, first, if you come across this situation, be reasonable. Talk to your FBO manager. Talk to the line person. Let them know of your concerns. Sometimes we've seen on a number of occasions the FBO address those problems, either to mark down the rate or the fee or take other corrective action. If you don't have any success there, we recommend going to the airport sponsor. And the guidance that came out in December from the FAA specifically talked about airports being expected to address and hear these concerns from airport users. So if you have no success with the FBO, you really should be going to the airport. The airport sponsor really should have a role in addressing these concerns, and they should have processes in place for doing that. Ultimately, if you need to go to the FAA, that would be something you'd have to begin with anyway. We'd also encourage you to submit your complaints and your concerns to us, because that helps us get a better understanding of what's going on, where we're seeing problems, and helps us understand the big picture. And we have that up on our website, aopa.org/FBO fees. The other thing that is really a big center point in the guidance is airport expectations. What are expected of airports?
Right.
And one of the big things there is what are the rules, and really efforts to promote competition. How do we make sure that these fees are competitive? And just to emphasize something that Ken said, you know, airports have really given FBOs a significant amount of power at these airports. One thing we didn't talk about, the TSA airport security requirements. A lot of this has resulted in all of the transient traffic going to the FBO. So if you want to land at an airport, you have to deal with the FBO. That's the only place that you can park your plane. So these FBOs have been given a lot of power, and the airports need to be exercising a certain amount of oversight and making sure that the FBO isn't abusing that privilege. And many of them haven't. As Mark said, most of them are doing a really good job. But in certain cases, it has been abused, and that has really led to the Part 13 complaints. But it really gets at to this effort about competition and how can we make sure that we are promoting that as best as possible.
Yeah, and in some places, some locations, the reality is they cannot sustain more than one FBO.
Sure.
That's the reality. And there are over 3,000 FBOs in this country. And then we're talking about 40 or 50. So it seems like a relatively small number, although these tend to be heavily trafficked locations. But some of them are, maybe it's taken a bit too far, but a natural monopoly. And when you have that type of situation, the solutions are more complicated because you can't have competition. So that's why we're promoting alternative access. We don't want to get into price regulation. That's a very slippery slope.
Right.
That's a type of regulation that is an absolute last resort. But alternative access would be where the airport develops an area. You don't need to buy, you don't want to buy fuel. You don't want to go in and use the conference rooms. You don't want to use the fancy facilities. All you want to do is land your plane, park it, and go somewhere. And we don't have a problem with a reasonable fee being charged for that, but $300, $200, that's over the top.
Yeah, recently we saw up in, I think it was Minneapolis area, the $300, Seattle area, the $300, $350 fee just for dropping off a passenger.
Right.
I mean, it really is
I know, and the guy
egregious.
came back that afternoon and they wanted $300 more. But they discounted it down to $150.
Yeah.
Oh, how nice.
There you
So
go.
thank you very much. Have a good day.
And for an owner-flown pilot, this is a particularly big deal because they don't have an expense report to write it off on. They're not going to get a tax break or anything like that on this thing. This is coming right out of their pocket.
I think that's an important point, Tom, is that there are corporate operators where the shareholders are not on the airplane, the CEO or the executives are on the airplane. They're not aware, in many cases, of these other ancillary fees. And the pilots are primarily there to get them as a movement from one place to another place, and it all becomes part of the corporate. But if you're an owner-flown aircraft, piston twin, small turbines, light jet, you know this because it's coming out of your credit card and your deal. And the point is, this is not about saying it's free. It's about saying what's reasonable, and that's in the language that the FAA released was reasonable, fair, and not unjustly discriminatory. And that's as wide as a truck. But it certainly doesn't mean it could be, we saw from the one complaint we had early on, $2,500 for Boston Logan for 15 minutes to drop off a passenger, both ways, $5,000. That probably tips the scale at unreasonable.
I'd say so.
And I've seen, or we have the opportunity, as Ken's pointed out, to look at these alternative parking spaces. In many cases, they already exist. And I know, and Jeff will talk in a minute, but in the Twin City area, I know of places that are absolutely public parking for aircraft. They're just not charted. In many cases, they just need to be made aware of, and we want to work with the FAA and others to say, how do we chart those spots so you know you can get in and out of a gate if there happens to be a gate there, and call Uber or Lyft and go on your merry way, and whatever it is, it is.
And it really is a mechanism for stimulating competition. And that's really what I think the FAA pointed out in their guidance is reminding airports that, if you can open up alternative access, you can give pilots options when you're going to that airport. And I think it really forces people to compete more because the business isn't guaranteed simply when someone shows up.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened at Waukegan, right, Justin? Can you tell a little bit what happened there?
Yeah, so Waukegan, one of our Part 13 complaints was filed against them, and it was one of those situations where you land at the airport and you have to go to the single FBO on the field. There was nowhere else really to park. And in response, the airport has been great. We use the term self-help airport.
Yep.
Really an airport that is taking proactive measures in this area to either promote competition or do something else to make the fees reasonable. And what they did was open up an alternative ramp area, highlight that on their website. It's free parking, actually. They don't charge for anyone to come in, land, and use it. The only thing the transient pilots have to do is call ahead, get the gate access code. They'll get a reservation number. You land there. It doesn't cost anything. And the critical part of it is you're not forced to purchase services that you don't necessarily need or want. So You're not incentivized to buy fuel. You're not really required to buy fuel. You can buy fuel somewhere else if you don't want to, but it really gets to, you can get into the airport, do your business, your recreation, and get out and not be forced to buy anything you don't want.
Right. So really good news about Waukegan. And,
Right.
and as you said just today on our website, we've got the story up about how we've withdrawn that Part 13 complaint at Waukegan because they've done such a nice job of addressing the concerns that we've had. So Jeff, at Minneapolis, at the Airport Commission there, you manage not only MSP, but 6 general aviation airports that ring the city complex out there. What do you think about this, and from an airport operator's standpoint?
Let me give a perspective here, and let me break it into 2 pieces. The first part being that of the airports, the airport authority, whether it's an airports commission or an extension of city or county government or state government, and versus the FBO, who's a tenant on an airport
Right.
that works under the guise of a lease or some sort of a financial agreement. First of all, airports across the country, whether they're large or small, are inundated with a lot of regulatory oversight. It's a complicated process of regulations to guarantee safety on operational requirements that make people responsible for certain services they provide. You have to lease the land on which the business is located. You have to pay some fee to the airport authority for the services that they're providing to the public on behalf of the airport authority, which represents the community's interest. So what you've got is this very, very complicated kind of regulatory policy oversight that starts with the FAA writing guidance documents that basically tell you how you have to comply with the regulations. And these compliance requirements must be followed by the airport authority. They're called grant assurances. They're built into the agreement that authorizes airports to make improvements in the airport and receive money from the federal government to support these improvements. And in order to receive that money, you're obligated to follow through with the rules. And those rules basically say you cannot discriminate, you cannot give people exclusive rights, you've got to maintain a self-sustaining airport to the best possible degree that you can. So the airport authority tries to find that balance of providing the space for a private business on the other side of the airport to build a facility and maintain and operate it profitably so they can be successful and still pay an appropriate, reasonable fee back to the airport authority. I give you that background because the regulatory oversight the airport has does not require that we dictate the prices of services that are provided by the FBO, but in fact make sure that they are fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory. The FBO then gets to decide how much they want to charge tenants or people who come into the facility. I say tenants because some folks provide parking space and so forth on airports and provide hangars. Also, it's just the stopover that Justin just talked about. The bottom line here is that the FBO is to be monitored by the airport authority to make certain that they're treating people fairly and justly, but we don't dictate the cost of what they're charging or the costs that are charged to customers. Now, what does the FBO do as a private business? They're there for a profit. The airport authority realizes that, so it's a partnership between the airport authority, the public entity, and the private business FBO. I can be honest and simply tell you that over the years, I've not paid a great deal of attention during the 40 years in Minneapolis that I was there, where I was going in and checking the price of services provided by the FBO. We always assumed and believed that FBO set their prices based on their cost structure. If you have to build a building, you have to pay a lease on a ramp space of thousands and thousands of square feet, have to hire personnel to maintain the airplanes and park aircraft and take care of them properly and secure them and service the pilot and the passenger's needs, that's going to cost money. And on every different kind of an airport, whether it's a small airport or a large airport, those cost structures, they vary. So what you do is you end up basically trying to find that balance between the government side providing the facility, which is a public facility that will meet the needs of the community, and at the same time supporting the needs of the FBO to be a profitable business so they can provide the services. If they're not successful, you don't have an FBO on the airport. So these grant assurances, I won't get into the detail right now, but there are 4 or 5 grant assurances that the FAA requires that really are very fundamental to the managing of an airport, and we must comply with those. And what it says basically is that we have to be fair and reasonable, cannot discriminate, cannot give exclusive privileges, and have to generate enough money to pay for the facility that we are managing. One last thought, and that is when you look at an airport authority, think in terms of a landlord who is a property owner who's leasing out land or facilities like an apartment building or apartment complex or a shopping mall, or whatever the case may be. We are the landlords making certain that the tenants in the building or on our airports act and behave appropriately and responsibly to serve the needs of the community. And that's how we look at our job, and that's how I've managed it for all the years. I will tell you that I believe for the most part in the industry, I've never had a conversation where an airport director complained or suggested to me in a discussion that the fees that the FBO were charging were outrageous. However, when I think back over the course of my term in Minneapolis-St. Paul, there have been times where people have called and asked why are the prices so high? Why is there only one fixed base operator at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport? There are no other choices or alternatives. And there actually is rationale in a decision-making process that led to that. Finally, let me simply tell you that on the public side, there's a great deal of transparency. Before an airport authority can write a policy or a regulation or a rule, it's got to go through a public process. It has to go to a committee. The staff provides a draft of a document to a committee of the commission. That committee reviews it and sends it back to the staff. The staff makes the adjustments and appropriate corrections. That goes to the full board. Before the full board would vote on and make a determination to make it a legal requirement, we have to go through a public hearing process. So the pilots in the community, aviation folks, and any citizen who has an interest in the airport is invited to a public informational meeting first, and after that to a public hearing, which is a formal process. And after you've gone through that public process, then the decisions can be made by the board. So it's a landlord relationship. We're talking about leases and regulations and rules that the airport establishes as to how you're going to manage and operate your facility, and how you're going to behave as a tenant on that airport to provide and do the best thing you can for the local communities.
Right. Just to add one point to that, you know,
Sure.
the FAA really emphasized in the new guidance that it is really the airport's responsibility. This is the airport that must be conducting this oversight. The FAA does not regulate FBOs. It's really the airport's role.
You're absolutely right, Justin. And what's more important is the FAA just released a new FAA guidance letter on December the 7th of 2017. There is nothing in that guidance letter that is new information to any airport manager in the country. That is a kind of a redefinition, clarification of existing policies that have existed for a very long time. So that letter is no surprise to anyone who reads it who's been running airports for a long, long while. But what it does do is it clarifies through a question and answer format what the responsibilities are. And what the FAA did say was it's the airport's responsibility to make certain that people are treated fairly and appropriately when they arrive on an airport and wish to park their airplane. And we can talk about more of the details of some of the nuances of that, but that is the public responsibility that a leader has in an airport.
Yeah, but let's return for a moment to what the airport responsibilities are, and indeed what the FBO's responsibilities are. Let me begin by just saying that at a lot of these airports, the 40 or 50 that Mr. Baker is referring to, in fact, you look at the drops in traffic of piston and to a somewhat lesser extent turbine at these airports, and it's scary. Mm-hmm. It is scary. It is scary in relationship to the national drop in piston traffic, which has happened over the years. But it's happening at these airports that have these particular attributes that we're discussing. But when you have a monopoly position that controls 100% of the space, that they can charge whatever fees that they want, you have the making of an insidious problem. And you overlay that with this transparency issue, which, in my opinion, the FBO should not wait for the airport authority to tell them, make your fees transparent, make them electronically available. The FBOs ought to be doing that on their own. They're occupying important large parcels of public space, and being able to extract rents from it. They ought to be telling us in advance all these fees, infrastructure fees, security fees, in addition to the ramp fees, and there might be a couple other fees by other names parading around.
Right. I think, Ken, your primary point is, we're always concerned about the transient traffic that then chooses not to fly. Because, as you well said, the idea you have a public airport, but a non-public access at a reasonable cost, whatever that is, something's wrong in our system where people now stop going there. And we also know that these tie-in arrangements, in some cases where the FBO controls a large set of the hangars and the leaseholds, and then requiring a significant part of your fuel purchases, we're not sure that's right either, right?
Yes, and these tying arrangements, where you have to buy something maybe you don't want, in order to just use the airport, basically, because you gotta have a place, right, to park your aircraft, and you show up, and they say, well, you may have thought you paid for this airport, but we have this under a lease for 20 or 30 years, and we have a fee here, and you want to park your planes, you're going to pay that fee. Now, in exchange, if you don't want to pay the fee, we'll either deeply discount that fee or waive it altogether in a lot of instances if you buy fuel that sometimes is marked $3 and $4 above the price per gallon at other area airports.
I would argue that I think that, not argue, I would simply say that I think that based on the FAA regulations and the grant assurances that airports have agreed to and are obligated to, that it is not unreasonable to expect airports to take a closer look at these rates and charges. If I had an airport that was receiving this kind of a complaint activity, I would go talk to the FBO. That would be the first step. Right. My responsibility to my community is to make these services available in a competitive manner so folks are encouraged to come. And we, in Minneapolis, we have 7 airports, and they're there because we want people to come to our community, generate business activity, leisure and pleasure recreational activities to enhance the community and provide and to pay and contribute to the success of our communities. And if the airport's permitting an activity to take place where you're discouraging certain classifications or groups, and I'll be very blunt, I will tell you that in Minneapolis-St. Paul, we don't necessarily like to have the small single-engine propeller airplane with four seats landing at MSP, because we have the 6 other airports around the metro area as a kind of an alternative choice, a better place to go for the services for that type of airplane. Why is that? Not because we don't like small airplanes. I've been flying small airplanes for 50 years. We want to preserve the capacity of the large international airport to meet the needs of large capacity airplanes that require 8 to 10, 11,000 foot runways. And when you put a slow, smaller single engine 4-passenger plane in that mix, it does slow down the operation. But remember, the FAA regulations say every aircraft has a right to have access to every single airport in the nation. And regardless of size of the airport or size of the airplane, that is not a factor. If you call on the radio and ask for permission to land, the FAA Air Traffic Control Tower will clear you in for the approach to any airport in the land. We have to support that. That's exactly the way this system should operate. And then we try to support that. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we want to generate more activity and bring the community into our airports in the Twin Cities. And we've placed those airports around the Twin Cities area so they're conveniently located to where you want to ultimately go as part of your destination. Now, this is an airport system of 7 airports in one metropolitan area. Across the country, there are lots of very, very good airports, but in smaller communities where there's not enough business activity to support two FBOs. And if there's no opportunity to provide that support, it becomes kind of a monopoly appearing arrangement, which is really not a monopoly. It's a business that, quite frankly, can barely support itself oftentimes, and could not survive if there was a competitor on board adjacent to their ramp. In Minneapolis, we have one FBO at the International Airport, Signature Flight Support. How did that happen? 30 years ago, 25 years ago, there were 2 parcels of land that were large enough to support 2 FBOs. One FBO was very successful, the other was not very successful, and ultimately what happened is the second FBO said to us, we are either going to have to merge or sell our business or go out of business. The Airports Commission looked at this issue for probably a year or a year and a half, and ultimately it resulted in a combining of those 2 into one business. And all of a sudden you find a situation where just because of economic survival, the 2 identified locations are now consolidated into one, and that's the only place you can go on the airport to park your airplane. Just to mention TSA complications and so forth, it's always a challenge as to how you meet the security requirements of the federal government, but the bottom line is that's the way it is. So what do? We should be taking, as airport managers, we should be taking a look at how the FBO is treating the customer and what kind of charges are being placed. We should not dictate the price. The price is a decision of the business based on their cost structures, and the federal guidelines say that as well.
Right. An important point is we need FBOs to be profitable.
Yes.
This isn't about trying to put FBOs out of business, because we need a robust infrastructure of FBOs around the country. Mark, you and I have flown internationally a lot. We've been in a lot of situations in other parts of the world where there is not a good FBO infrastructure, and it's problematic.
Yeah, I think we want to overemphasize, and I think it's important to recognize that most, again, are really doing, and a lot of them are good friends of AOPA, myself, you know these people a long time, and they do a really good job and are fair.
Right.
Where the concern is when I hear about traffic that's down, and people making decisions not to go to those places where the airport has been built on public domain, public money, for that reason it's called a port. It's a way to enter that marketplace and access from a business, recreation, that's what it's there for. And my primary concern about this whole thing is when we don't have an alternative, where it's appropriate. And I know the Minneapolis area, and I've been a tenant for a long time. You know, I'm not interested in flying my Super Cub into MSP.
Right.
I did it once actually, but it's not something that you want to do on a daily basis because you have good alternatives.
Right.
But I don't like and I will not accept the idea you shouldn't go to that airport.
Right.
It should be a choice. It should be up to you, and you should have reasonable access and reasonable fees and pursue it that way. I don't really want to follow a whole bunch of Delta airplanes in there, and there's great alternatives.
Right.
But in some cases, and we know where they are, and the Keys, or you name them, a whole bunch of airports and unique locations where there is one provider, that people are now making a decision not even to go to that state.
Yep.
Because they don't feel like they can access it at a reasonable fee. That's wrong.
Right. But it does bring up the question that we sometimes hear people asking when we talk about this issue, which is, well, if you don't like the price or the fees at a particular airport, it's a free market, just go somewhere else. You don't have to go there. There are alternatives.
Well, that's why I get really angry, because I think that's...
That's me pulling a lever there.
Yeah, that is just not acceptable in my mind. When, you know, again, if these are privately built entities, and we do have a number, not a great number, of privately built airports that have a private FBO that offer a service and have to compete for the marketplace, but they've invested their own capital. They can charge whatever they want. They are a real free enterprise, capitalistic alternative. But most of our airports are built with public funds to create public access. The public access doesn't mean you can just do a touch and go at that airport. It means you should be able to access the roadway somewhere else off airport at a reasonable level.
Right. And
that's where I get pretty darned excited. Yeah. You know that.
I may have picked up on that at some point along the way. But competition, as we've said, is an important part of this, and that's where we've seen some real successes. We've seen some of these self-help airports really step up and introduce competition in some really unusual ways. Justin, talk about Orange County. That was one of the very first ones to make changes that were really supportive of this notion.
Yeah, Orange County was really one of the first examples, and there the Board of Supervisors, the airport sponsor, was hearing from airport users about the pricing there and the high prices, and they ultimately, not to go into the details, but they essentially threw one of the FBOs out because they were not being competitive enough with their pricing. And there's some litigation and administrative complaints filed over that situation, and the FAA finally issued back in the summer a pretty notable opinion order that the airport has a responsibility to consider pricing when selecting an FBO, and that is something that I think really needs to be highlighted and really highlighted by everyone here, that it is a way to promote competition. They should be soliciting bids from various companies out in the market and making sure that pricing is a central factor when selecting your FBO. And that is a way for airports to make sure that their pricing is competitive. So it was a really good example, I think.
Yeah, and the number of self-help airports in this country is growing. Now, maybe that's a term we coined, but it basically is where the airport itself is trying to solve its problems. And I'd just like to add to that point that an important part of AOPA's effort here is to shine a spotlight on this, to encourage dialogue between the airports, the FBOs, the pilots, the trade associations that are involved with this, and the FAA. This is an area that relatively little attention has been paid to. And we started paying attention when our complaint meter went up. And the complaint meter went up, it correlated clearly with this wave of consolidations and these creation of these monopoly positions at these heavily trafficked airports. We do not have all the answers. We're not in an end state, and we encourage this dialogue, and we think there's a big value in shining the spotlight on this issue. You know, when you look back at FAA's opinions over the years in dealing with FBOs, they essentially are fights between the FBOs or fights between the FBO and the airport, and they often don't focus at all on the users, the ultimate users of the place. We aim to change that. We will change that.
And we have.
Yeah. And And but again, we don't have all the answers, and we think just shining the spotlight on it, that there's an enormous value in it, and you're going to continue to see us on this issue.
Right. And so an important one, complicated one actually, and number one complaint about airport has taken some actions. It's been rewarding to see that, but the spotlight has caused Heber City, Utah to make some changes at their airport. Talk about that one.
Yeah, Heber City. You know, I'm glad you raised that, because I mentioned earlier that one of the attributes is a monopoly position, usually by a large chain FBO. Heber City is not a large chain FBO, but it's clearly a monopoly position. They've been in place, and we're involved with that. We think the City Council is a self-help airport. They're trying to take control of their own situation. And there were a lot of complaints about high prices. Indeed, I think Heber City was the most complained about airport in the United States for the high prices. And so we entered that one, and the City Council was trying to take corrective action. And you know, the FBO has turned around and suing the airport authority, and it's also suing the pilot that was complaining about the place. So they've been
for those who don't know where Heber City is, it serves the kind of the Park City area of Utah, on the other side of the mountains. A very glamorous, beautiful area, and it's the only general aviation access airport to that part of the ski mountains of Utah.
Right.
So you wouldn't entertain the idea that you should use an alternative airport?
It's a long darn ways to Wyoming to the alternative.
So another example of a self-help airport is Santa Barbara, which was facing some challenges, and they actually reached out to us for some guidance. Justin, you were heavily involved in that. Talk about it.
Yeah, Santa Barbara is, again, another self-help airport. We did receive complaints about that airport, but they actually reached out to us and wanted help. And this was early on before the FAA issued the recent guidance, but they really wanted guidance in this area. They said, you know, the FAA hasn't said anything about this. What do we do? How do we take corrective action? And so the interesting thing there, mid-year 2018, so in about 6 months, the leases will expire for both of the FBOs at that field. And they want to make sure that they are considering pricing in a new request for proposal when they're going to solicit new bids, and either replacing or keeping the current FBOs at that field. So we offered some high-level recommendations for what should be included in that request for proposal, and potentially the lease agreement that results from the new leases. And several of the high-level recommendations that we made, one of them is obviously pricing has to be a central consideration. That's the way you can promote competition between potential companies that want to go in and offer services to the public there. So pricing has to be a central focus, and if you're going to issue a long-term lease, a 20, 30-year lease like Ken was talking about, how are you going to ensure that these fees are staying reasonable over the course of that lease agreement?
Right.
And that's a critical point, because you can't just get in there and then increase them once you've gotten your positioning. So that was a central focus, and we also talked about transparency. You know, airports have a lot of tools and authority at their disposal, stuff that they can do to, again, conduct this oversight when they feel like the situation overpricing at the airport has gotten out of balance. And one of the things that we've recommended is having the airport require in the lease agreement that the FBO disclose publicly and in real time and electronically what their fees are, and kind of bringing a spotlight to what's being charged there. And some other tools to make sure that the airport can conduct its oversight. But I think we're really proud of what's been going on there, and proud of that self-help airport.
Right.
Yeah, Santa Barbara also was an example of an airport where they want to create an alternative access area, and there's a security issue involving the Transportation Security Administration. So we're working with the airport and Transportation Security Administration to work a solution. And we don't have enough time to explain what the security problem there is. You don't want to hear it, but there is a problem, and we're learning a lot about TSA's ways and approaches to solving the security problem there.
Right.
I do think that the security issue at Santa Barbara is replicated at other airports in this country that also seek to have alternative access.
Yes.
And we have seen airports that have good GA access that also serve air carriers that have TSA issues. There are ways to get that done given the right airport layout and opportunity.
Yeah, but the TSA, I mean, let's face it, the TSA has a heavy responsibility to protect the nation's travelers and also to support aviation as it grows. From an airport's perspective, quite frankly, it's difficult to figure out how you can park an airplane on some of these commercial airports that are larger and have people park at no cost or at fair cost. Let's say a fair price. Let's say it's $20 or $30 to park there for a day or whatever. But how do you get the people from their airplane off the airport through a security area, then how do you get them back to the airplane? Probably have to go through some sort of a facility or some sort of a gate arrangement with an advanced reservation. The bottom line is that the airport authority is the party that receives the fine from the TSA if there's a violation of security regulations. And they can be very, very hefty, $10,000, $15,000. So airports are very reluctant until there's been a solid plan put together and it's shown and proven to be successful to implement these sorts of strategies. But it's just part of the increasing complexity of regulations, multiple federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies that lay these rules upon airports, trying to manage through all of these issues to protect the traveling public.
Right. One thing we're asking the FAA to do when it comes to alternative access, when there aren't a lot of security issues or we can figure out the security issues, is to chart the alternative parking areas and that sort of thing. Justin, you've been talking to them about that. How receptive they are? How likely is it we're going to start to see on our runway, our taxiway and runway diagram, that there's an area shaded box on there that this is the public parking area?
Yeah, this is a really important topic because again, it gets to the idea of promoting competition at the airport, giving pilots options when you go into an airport, so that you're not forced into a singular option.
Yep.
So again, charting is extremely important, so you know what those options are ahead of time. Really, the first step that we're trying to do is find a way to standardize how the charting would be. So right now, if you look at any airport diagrams out there, you're going to see it's going to be labeled various things: GA parking, transient parking, GA apron. I mean, there's so many different names about this stuff that if you're looking at these airport diagrams, you have no idea if I'm allowed to go here or not. So the first thing is really about standardizing what all these terms mean so that people can really understand what their options are. And then it's getting the airports to make sure that these areas are being charted, that they're obviously available, but then that they're charted on the maps. And that's something that we're working very hard on. I think it really gets to the competition aspect, creating a competitive landscape, and we're hoping to get that done probably within the next 6 months. But charting takes some time, so that's going to be some time. But I think we need to start it with the standardizing of what all these things mean. And
this just to reinforce this point, the alternative access potential in this country. We're starting work on this in a big way, but we sure could use FAA's help. You would think FAA would be in probably a command and control position in knowing where these places were airports, and we could also use the help of airports. This is a big deal issue. We actually found one airport, didn't we, where someone calling a plane, it was secret. Where they
don't want to tell you.
They didn't want it well known that there was an alternative access area, and it was not charted, but it actually existed.
Right. Yeah. Even it's a pretty significant. Miami International actually has a general aviation transient ramp. It's access, not part of the FBO. Anoka County, if you park by the tower, is a general aviation access ramp. None of that is charted.
It is not.
And that's an opportunity for us to say, if you don't need any services and there is a gate and there's a way to access the roadway, let's get that charted.
And and we don't think about it in these terms, but if you're an aircraft owner, of course there's always the impression that people who own airplanes and fly them are wealthy, and that's not necessarily the case at all. But the reality is that a person who owns an airplane has to register that airplane every year, has to go through a required maintenance, an annual maintenance inspection of the airplane, which is not cheap. They have to pay for the taxes on the fuel that they put in the airplane when they fly, and the more they fly, the more it costs. The bottom line is that aviation is not free. If you own the airplane, you've got to maintain and take care of it. And you earn the right, I think, to fly into airports and use their facilities just by virtue of the fact that you've paid these fees to maintain the airplane by being licensed and properly inspected. So there's a cost regardless, and the pilot or the corporation or the company or the person flying the airplane is contributing to the financial success of airports and the air transportation network across the country. And we lose sight of that, I think, an awful lot of the time.
I think a point on that, in talking to one of our good friends at NATA, which is the association that represents a lot of the FBOs, at the end of the day, we have to buy fuel somewhere.
Right.
So somewhere in the ecosystem, somebody's getting a transaction. All we're trying to do is say, if we choose to buy fuel there at this price because of that service, that's a choice we can make. But we have no choice, and we're kind of locked into it. That's something we want to examine a little further to say what it is. But the ecosystem needs to work all the way around, and again, we've said it over and over, the large majority work pretty well. We just should not be locked out of certain access points because of fees that are just egregious.
So we are going to be taking questions. If you have questions out there, please go ahead and just type those on the screen, and we'll have somebody monitoring. Then we'll be posting or taking some of the questions in just a few minutes. But another lever, we talk about competition, that can be pulled is the introduction of either self-fueling or potentially another FBO, and we've seen that, or at least work beginning on that in some of these other self-help airports, right?
Yes, and maybe it's a little hackneyed to say you've seen one airport, but there is some truth in that statement, I think, and the self-service fueling is one of them. We have seen any number of lease provisions that say you can't offer self-service fueling unless you offer the full range of FBO services. And I think those particular provisions ought to be revisited by the cognizant airport authority. But that too is self-service fueling if you can't sustain a second FBO, and you have leased out 100% of your access space.
Right.
Well, self-service fueling is another competitive vehicle, just like you point out.
Yeah, a perfect example of that, Cedar Rapids. They had a single monopoly FBO there as well, and they recently introduced a self-serve fuel station for avgas. And they actually funded it mostly, or in part, by state grant funds. So, there are ways that airport sponsors can take action, introduce competitive options for airport users, but we want to get them aware of these options. I think that's a really critical part. Right.
So one reminder, we've had actually a question to that effect, is will the webinar be available? Yes, it will be available. From an archive standpoint, later you'll get if you registered, you'll get a link that takes you directly to that. Another one was if fuel prices are published, why not fees? We've talked a little bit about efforts we're trying to make fees more transparent. Why do you suppose it is that FBOs are so reluctant to post their fees?
Maybe we all can take a shot at that, but my take is that part of it is custom, just the way things have been. Second is that no pressure has been applied. A third argument that I would dismiss out of hand is that the prices change frequently. In this day and age, the fact that prices change daily is not a relevant factor to me. There's technology available that can capture that. Just try booking an airplane flight and see how long that fare is up there. You're talking about a matter of minutes, believe me. I think the more sophisticated that you get in pricing fuel, that you realize that the price of fuel may in some ways dictate what your ramp fee is, so that the two are closely correlated. But I think you have to be a large enough FBO, sophisticated enough to develop algorithms to make those types of judgments.
Right.
But most of the arguments we've heard don't really carry much weight. And I just come back to the point. I mean, why should FBOs wait for the airport to say, we're going to put a provision in your lease to make sure that you make your prices transparent and available in approximately real time?
I think there is an issue that we don't fully understand. We need to understand it better. Is in some markets where there are multiple FBOs, you have all kinds of different ranges of fuel prices that are actually paid. You got a retail posted price, which some cases some people tell us gets never charged, except for the little guy pays at retail. And there's all these discounted cards, so therefore the fee structure for this many pounds of aircraft is different too. I suggest pretty strongly that we should be able to simplify. If you've got this range, it might be this cost. But I think they have made it overly complex, and in some cases post egregiously high fuel prices to therefore channel traffic away. And that's where I'm suspicious, and I'm challenging the idea that they should be able to post artificially high prices without an alternative spot. If you want to charge, you know, $3 to $5 above what the market is in the 25 or 30 mile range, God bless. But if we get stuck, that's the only way we can access that airport without a reasonable ramp fee. That's the problem. We can't be held hostage.
Yeah, hey, well, I must add, I left out of my little litany of reasons why the fees sometimes aren't transparent. I had one person tell me that the reason that they're not transparent is because we don't really charge those prices.
Yes, right.
I'm saying, wait a minute, this is getting too circular. I can't follow this argument. And the idea was, well, so many people are using discount cards that our retail price of fuel is not really the price we charge.
Although I've been charged that.
Okay, yeah.
Lots of times.
Yeah. Yep. So how often does it occur? This relates to another question we got that asks, what can we do when an airport sponsor is discriminating against piston pilots? And I'm not sure the exact context of that question, except I can imagine that there are some airport sponsors that are almost encouraging FBOs to charge high fees and high fuel prices because the airport gets a percentage of that, in many cases, back to them, which helps fund their own operations. How prevalent is that, and what can be done about that?
We don't know how prevalent it is, but it happens. We did an FAA search of leases at a number of airports in this country, and we were surprised. We were frankly surprised at the number of lease provisions we found where the airport itself took a cut of the profits from the FBO.
Right.
And of course, if you speak to the FBO said, well, here's one reason the prices are so high. But we don't have a command of that situation nationally.
Okay.
Let me put a perspective on that, however, as
I
an airport
thought you might have a perspective on that, Jeff.
The reality is that we do have a variety of fees that we charge through our leasing mechanism, which is a public document that's been approved in a public arena, where if you're an FBO at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, you're going to pay a certain amount of so many cents per square foot of ramp space that you are occupying for your buildings and the parking area for aircraft. And you're also going to pay a percentage of your gross sales. And so the logic is that, okay, if the airport authority receives 1.5% of your gross sales, the more gross sales you have, the more money the airport authority takes in. And as a result, we're all kind of growing our financial base and making more money. But the reality is, particularly in metropolitan areas where you've got an international airport or air carrier operations, the contribution of 1.5% of the FBO compared to the amount of money being brought in by the concessions and terminal buildings, the fuel that's pumped into commercial airliners when they stop and refuel and load passengers and offload folks, that 1.5% is pretty insignificant when it comes to the actual generation of revenues. I keep going back to Minneapolis because I know it so well, obviously, but gross revenues this year in Minneapolis, ending 2017, probably around $350 million. And that's money that's taken in that the airport uses to make all the improvements and additions and so forth at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. That pales dramatically. It's a very small portion of the airline fees are paid, and the overall revenues the airport gets from the overall airport operation is significant, but the contribution of GA and transit aircraft landing and taking off at the airport is relatively insignificant. So over my career in airport management, I've never heard an airport discussion talking about wanting to push the pricing of services up at the FBO to generate more money for the airport authority. In smaller communities, or where there's one FBO where the rates are quite high, there may be a greater impact, particularly if you've got a location where there's an awful lot of corporate jet activity because of some unique service being provided in that community. But from the standpoint of just my long history in the business, I would say that I've never had that discussion.
And I generally agree with that, Jeff, that if the airport sponsor has a percentage of, fuel flowage of 8, 10 cents, 12 cents a gallon, they're looking for more volume. Actually, everybody wins with more volume. Right. And whether it's 1% of revenue, those are not inhibitors, because then you should be mutually aligned with the idea you're going to do better with more volume. We have seen some in his FOIA contracts, however, where there's just a pretty high fee, and in many cases, we know locally, they don't pay anything to the airport sponsor. They're just here as a service, and you know, they're inclined for high margins for themselves, not in a sharing. So there's a lot of different, you know, as Ken well said, one airport, you've seen one airport, there's a lot of different variations on that theme. I think we would be aligned with people saying, you know, the more volume, the better off we all are.
Yes.
I do think there's a perspective here, though, about, on the one hand, every one of us tonight has spoken about the airport self-help, the airport
Correct.
oversight.
Yes.
And I hope it is so, that the revenues that are received by the airport from the FBO are de minimis and don't really matter that much in the scheme of things, because it is a tough spot for an airport to be told, make sure the pricing is reasonable, fair, and not unjustly discriminatory. And at the same time, if you're trying to make this airport make ends meet financially, take a cut of the profits of the FBO. I do think there's somewhat of a tension in there.
I understand your logic, and I think it's legitimate. And I think that, quite frankly, going back to the transparency issue, that's part of the whole fairness and equal treatment of customers at the airport. I think it's worth looking at. I think it's worth having a discussion, and I think that people who have been treated improperly, at least they feel they have been with pricing structures at an airport, the first call they should make is to the airport authority and ask, what can be done about this? Is this fair and reasonable? I think it was unreasonable, and I feel as if I was taken advantage of because there were no other choices. That's when I would make a phone call to the airport authority, talk to their legal staff if they have one, or talk to the airport manager in a smaller facility and raise that question. No question about it.
Right. Ken, a few minutes ago, you talked about the fact that we don't have all the answers. And we don't have all the answers. So what we've done is we've turned to some others. We've formed an airport access advisory panel who has met once already, and we have another meeting coming up in a couple of weeks. Talk about who's on that panel and what their purpose is.
Yeah, we formed an advisory panel that's very diverse. It's got FBOs on it. It's got airport operators on it. It's got users on it. It's a very diverse group. And we've had one meeting. And you know, people say, well, advisory panels, you should have advisory panels. Well, I can tell you, this is such a complicated area, so loaded with minefields, so many complicated policy choices, so many interests that are legitimate to consider, that you need a diverse group like that to give you candid advice about navigating the path forward. And so we're meeting again in a couple weeks.
Right.
We have learned a great deal from them, and they're helping to guide our efforts.
Right. We have another question that asks whether or not there might be a place on AOPA's website where pilots can post user fees and do ratings of FBOs and airports and that sort of thing. And I guess I would say stand by. We are working on something like that that will be out in the next few months, where it'll be a lot easier for pilots to go online and see hopefully what the fees are. We'll see how that goes, but also about ways that pilots can go on and post comments a lot more easily about the airport and share their experience. And FBOs, of course, will have a chance to respond to that too if they feel that they've been unfairly treated. But we are trying to provide more tools online through our website to make it easier for pilots to report what they're experiencing. And another one, any update on Heber City? I understand the FBO has filed a suit in federal court intended to protect the FBO there. So Ken, you talked about that a little bit, or Justin, you've been on that?
Yeah, it really gets to, we've talked about this a little bit, minimum standard, an airport's minimum standards. Right. And some people are familiar with that term, some are not. Airport minimum standards are really the guiding regulation, so to speak, that the airport has put together for the various businesses at the airport. And again, some of them require that any FBO at the airport have fueling, aircraft rental, aircraft flight training, various different things. And these minimum standards can really be drafted in many different ways. But the heart of the dispute was the revision of the minimum standards that the airport sponsor did to facilitate competition. And they essentially allowed, through their revisions, to they allowed a self-service fuel facility to come onto the airport and compete. And there's various parts of the lease agreement that the FBO felt were violated there with that move, and so they filed an action. But really, it gets to the heart of the airport's actions to revise minimum standards, facilitate competition, and really try to bring down the fees that airport users are required to pay.
Right. So another question, Steve asked, do FBOs pay land lease for the land under their ramp? And this probably gets back to the, if you've seen it in one airport, you've seen one airport. Some of them do, I suppose, and some of them don't. Jeff, what's your thought on that?
I believe most of them do. For example, if you rent or want to buy or build a hangar on an airport, you're going to pay for the square footage land that's covered by that building. FBOs at airports do pay a per square foot lease rate normally on the land that's the ramp, as well as the land that their buildings sit upon.
Right.
And that's part of how they build their cost structures to determine what they're going to do as far as rates and charges to users who come and use their facilities.
Right. But it's important to keep in mind that frequently those ramps were built with public money.
They were.
Through the AIP grants. And in talking about airport sponsors, it's also important to remember that AIP money is Airport Improvement Program, and that airports get this money to help improve their airports. But that money is not available for use for daily operations, plowing snow, cutting the grass, and taking just general care of the airfield. So that's why it is important that airports do have a revenue stream coming in, and typically coming from users via whether it's rent from FBOs, it's rent from those of us who maybe rent hangars on the field, and in some cases landing fees. And people sometimes confuse when they hear about fees, sometimes they confuse landing fees, which are typically charged by the airport to help them cover some of their costs, as opposed to ramp fees and infrastructure fees and security fees and those kind of things, which typically are ones that the FBOs charge.
Right, and sometimes the pilot's head is spinning with all these fees.
Yes,
because
it's more confusing than it needs to be.
Most of the fees we've been talking about here are ones that are assessed by the FBO, but there are a large number of instances where the FBO itself is a collection agent for the airport authority. So the pilot shows up and there's 5 or 6 different fees and things. You know, please help me.
Well, and also let's be very forthcoming here. I mean, the airport does set the fee that they expect to get from an aircraft that's going to be using facilities. That may not be the fee that's charged to the pilot who just landed and parked his or her airplane. That may be, maybe it's $10 to the airport authority or $3 per 1,000 pounds of weight of the airplane. But if you're paying $25, a 3,000 to 4,000 pound airplane at $3 a 1,000 pounds is only about $9, $10, $12. So the other $8 or $9 or $10 on top is profit for the FBO. We're not saying that that's right or wrong. Simply saying that is it reasonable to pay $20 to park an airplane overnight at an airport? And in most cases, it probably is. $50, $100, $300. That's when an airport authority has to step back and say to itself, is this reasonable? Is this fair? Are we treating the traveling public the appropriate way?
Yep.
I do think I want to finish up on the ramp space, because we do know of a number of instances where the FBOs have been charging overnight ramp fees, and yet are not paying anything for that ramp. So it is a circumstantial kind of thing that we need to get a lot smarter on, but it is public information and we can get to it.
Right. Okay, so we're about out of time, but I wanted to ask y'all one more question. We've been working on this for about a year, pretty intensely for about a year. What do you think, Mark, in 2 to 3 years, what's your hoped outcome? What's it going to look like in a couple of years if we're successful?
And I think Michael, where we kind of wrapped it up right, I think the right things will generally get done. I think the free market, where we can institute that alternative parking, encourage competition where it makes sense, to remind the airport sponsors where it can be done. And if some private entity wants to come in there and feels like there's enough volume there, to encourage that. I think largely over the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see movements of more competition, alternative parking spaces that will be plotted, that the free market will ultimately prevail. In most of the cases, I think the airport sponsors generally want to do a good job in making sure that their port is used widely and broadly to support their community. So I think we're doing the right thing early on. I don't think we're going to have instantaneous responses in all these positions in the next 6 months. But I think we're doing a good job of bringing focus to this, and I think for the most part there are reasonable solutions.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, I would say this year I would expect to see some inroads on this transparency issue. I mean, that's a ground floor issue.
It's hard to argue with that.
2018, I mean, you know, I like to stand up in court and make that argument because it's an easy one, hands down. I think the alternative access, that we can make some inroads in that over the next 2 years, definitely, and get them charted. I believe that just shining the spotlight on this is going to inspire on a larger number of self-help airports.
Right.
And I think that we owe it to our membership to stay on top of this issue because it is one of the major arms of the affordability of flying calculus.
Right. So to our two attorneys over here, I'll start with you, Justin. Are we going to see any more Part 13 complaints?
I think people should expect some additional Part 13 complaints. Yes, we'll see when this year, but I think they're coming. Yeah.
Okay.
But again, just to emphasize, I mean, promoting competition again at the airport and between airports as much as possible, I think is really the critical thing here. Making sure that you can get into an airport without being forced to buy fuel or other services. You know, we hear about folks who want to buy fuel at an airport that they're departing from. It's cheaper fuel, they prefer to buy it there, but they don't want to because they know when they go to their destination, they're going to have to pay for that fuel because of the ramp fees and the various situation there. So I think by using the alternative access, you're really going to open up competition between airports for some of these critical services. And I think that's a really important point that isn't emphasized enough.
Yeah, and if additional Part 13 complaints will not come as a complete surprise to the airport involved.
Oh, okay. That'll be a heads up then. Jeff, what about you? What do you think is going to happen?
Certainly, we're talking about competition. I think that competition is good because you've got two folks that are kind of battling it out, and that kind of forces the market to reach a reasonable price. Secondly, transparency. I think people, pilots in particular, using airports should know what the charges are going to be when they arrive. You fly into the airport once and you're not aware of those prices, and you get dinged with a $300 or $400 bill and have to buy gas, and so they knock off maybe $100, but that's a pretty expensive way to operate an airplane. You're probably not going to go back there again, or only if you have to, and you're not going to be very happy about it. So from a business perspective, it just seems to me like fair pricing, reasonable pricing, and good customer service would be a much more successful model. Probably from my perspective, though, the most important aspect is I think in the next couple of years we can shine a lot of light on airport authorities and airports around the country, make them much more aware of what their lease provisions are and what the FBO is doing as part of their business model. And I think that the airport and the FBO can certainly work together as partners to come to some resolution on how some of these issues can be resolved. Because at the end of the day, the FBO wants to make money, the airport wants to serve its community, and we want a safe air transportation system that's top quality that meets everybody's needs. So I say more diligence on the part of airports.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, for taking some time to talk about this important issue. Thank you all for watching. Hope that you found this informative. Watch the AOPA channels. We do webinars on a pretty regular basis about one subject or another. We hope you find them useful, and this one will be out in the archive soon, so you can go back and watch and pick up all the details. Thanks for watching.